It's good to have you with us. It's obviously a very poignant day, VE Day, 80 years since peace was declared in Europe. Obviously, Second World War continued in the Asian theatre and the Pacific theatre for longer. How do you reflect on a day like today?
Well, I think it's so important because, as you know, and it's very poignant in many ways, we are losing the living link to those who served, as it were. Some still with us, and it's been wonderful to see them involved in recent days. We saw on Bank Holiday Monday someone who's going to be 101 very soon, you know, holding the torch that set off the procession down the Mall. But I think, for me, there are two really critical things. The first is to honour our veterans, and the second is to look at the world as it is today and take lessons from what's happened. And I think the most important of all, especially when you look at Russia-Ukraine, is to never be complacent about the threats we face and to back our armed forces in what, unfortunately, are unstable times.
Talk about those unstable times. You reference Russia and Ukraine there. You have to, especially on a day when we commemorate victory in Europe. There is still full-scale war on the European continent 80 years later, and it's been going on now for years itself. How confident are you that that can be brought to an end when you see Russia celebrating its victory over the Nazis and it's utilising the victory of 80 years ago as a premise for continuing war 80 years on?
You're absolutely spot on. And you know, we all desperately want to see peace there, and above all, the people of Ukraine who've been bombed, who've been brutalised by Russia's totally unprovoked invasion. In fact, when we debated VE Day in Parliament this week, I made the point that it was so moving to see Ukrainian soldiers as part of our VE Day procession, and I said I hope that they will have a VE Day one day, and I really hope they do. But we can't have a sort of gesture peace for a few days so that Putin can do his thing in Moscow with his fellow dictators. What we need is a proper, lasting, sustainable peace, and one that Russia isn't seen to gain from, frankly. And so, unfortunately, we have no choice. We've got to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We've got to keep supporting them, but learn the lessons from that today and from the wars of the past, which are, you've got to stand up to aggressors.
How concerned are you about the situation between India and Pakistan?
I think it's important that we, do encourage de-escalation. I think the government are right about that. Obviously, they've got to use all their sort of diplomatic channels and strength. But as you know, these are two major military powers, nuclear armed, and we don't want to see wider escalation, particularly with the instability we have in the world as it is today.
You referenced their important partners. It looks as though, it appears, Sky News understands, that two very important partners with a special relationship set to announce a trade deal later today. Donald Trump posting about it on Truth Social. We've heard from 10 Downing Street spokesperson saying that Sir Keir Starmer will make a statement in due course. This must be a good day for the UK.
I hope so. I really hope so. I mean, we've not had any definitive news that there will be a trade deal. We've not had the equivalent of our white smoke, dare I say it. But I hope that we do. In principle, of course, in our party, we want to see strong trading relationship with what you're right to describe as our close ally, the United States, closest military ally, economic partner. But as you know, the devil is always in the detail, and we will await those details as they arise.
What will be the key areas of concern, the key areas of focus for your party?
Well, I think that, I wouldn't want to get drawn into trying to speculate what might be in it. Frankly, who knows? I think that you have to remember we're a service economy. So we want to, if there is a trade deal, we need to see good access for services. What's going to happen with those tariffs? But it is entirely speculative at the moment. In principle, we want to see a good deal for the UK.
But there are areas that the UK holds very dearly and has very stringent rules and regulations in, and the United States has a different perspective on healthcare, for example, food standards, for example. We've talked lots about chlorinated chicken, about growth promoters in meat production. We've talked about privatisation of healthcare in the US compared to the NHS that we have here in the UK. Surely there will be those areas, for example, that the diplomats and the discussions and the government will have to have done a good job to defend, because otherwise, how will they be able to defend this trade?
But Gareth, as you know, it depends on the depth. There's been some reporting, and it is all speculative, it has to be said, that this might be quite a thin deal, like a sort of top-level deal. So it's very hard for me to comment on that without seeing it. Yes, there have been areas of discussion before which might be controversial. Perhaps, therefore, it would be surprising if those were included, but that is without wishing to be repetitive, entirely speculative. I hope we get a deal in principle. It'd be good for the country, but we will look at the details very carefully.
A little frustrating for a party that was in power for 14 years that the Labour Party's done this in 9-10 months?
Not at all. I mean, it's by the way, first of all, it's had to because of the tariff situation. You know, when we left the EU, for those of us who, you know, I'd been Remain, but I accepted the result. You know, this was a democratic decision for me. One of the big advantages was an independent trade policy. We didn't see any enthusiasm for that from Keir Starmer. He wanted to stay in the customs union, which would have meant we couldn't vary our tariffs and therefore effectively would not have had an independent trade policy. So it's brilliant that he's converted to welcoming these negotiations. He's now got his India deal, which we have seen very little detail on. I hope we do get a good deal with the US, but it remains to be seen what the detail is. And I think the wider point is, why do we do trade deals to support the economy? We mustn't forget that out there in the UK today, businesses are struggling with recently imposed very high taxes. We've seen a report this morning from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which says that the biggest impact on the UK economy is not tariffs, it's the national insurance rises on employers imposed by Rachel Reeves.
It's fair to say, though, equally, that taxation did reach prior record highs under the Conservative government. The other thing I just want to also just pick up on is reports in the papers, figures from the National Audit Office with regards to the cost of housing migrants to this country, figures that are astronomically higher than was first thought.
But Gareth, 2 points. First of all, this thing about taxes under us, right? They
were at 70-year
highs.
highs.
Wait a minute. Of course they were. Why? I was Rishi Sunak's PPS throughout the pandemic. When we put in that place $500 billion of support, which we borrowed, 400 billion roughly for the pandemic, 100 billion for energy bills after Putin invaded Ukraine. Guess what? Taxes went up. And we were open about that. But at the time, the only call we had in the Treasury from politicians across the board, from the media, from everyone, was for even more support. So don't pretend there's some parallel universe where taxes weren't going to go up after all that happened. The fact is, the choices
that have been better explained to the country, though, as that was happening concurrently? Do you think the messaging could have been better about that?
When Rishi's Chancellor always said there will be a cost for these measures, of course, and the public understood that. The issue is, of course, when the bills come, no one wants to have to pay them, but we all know that was going to happen. When I canvassed on the doorstep, the one thing the public accepted is that taxes have gone up because of those huge borrowing costs from the pandemic and so on. The difference is now, you know, there are different choices. So, you know, as I just said, and I think it's really important, huge rise in employers' national insurance. That what the NISR have said today is that's pushing up inflation, it's reducing jobs in the economy, and it actually means the government will get less revenue from it. That decision was taken against, for example, what I think we should be doing, and what we've said is going further and faster on reducing the welfare budget, which will actually increase the supply of labour into the economy and will be really important. So there are choices to make now, but when we were faced with borrowing that vast amount of money at the time to keep the country safe during lockdown, we had to do it, and it was always going to have an impact.
Just finally, just revert back to our first thought, you will be going to Westminster later today?
Yes, so there's a service in Westminster Abbey at midday. Many MPs, ministers will be attending. A great privilege, and because the most important thing is that we all say thank you to those who served our country in the Second World War.
A sentiment many will agree with, surely. James Cartlidge, Shadow Defence Secretary, good to have you with us.
Thank you.